Hashtag a human saves a sinking off-world Leopard commander. Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his brow as he guided his exploration rover across the crimson landscape of Kepler 442b. The alien world stretched endlessly before him, its twin suns casting strange shadows across crystalline formations that jutted from the ground like frozen lightning. He had been alone on this planet for 3 weeks now, conducting geological surveys for the Terran Colonial Authority, and the isolation was starting to wear on him. The communication array back at base camp had malfunctioned 2 days ago, leaving him completely cut off from Earth and the orbital station. His only companion was the rover's AI, which had developed an annoying habit of reciting poetry during long drives. Jake had started turning it off just to enjoy the silence of the alien wilderness. As he crested a ridge overlooking a vast valley filled with what the initial surveys had called crystal lakes, Jake noticed something that made him slam on the brakes. The lakes weren't made of crystal at all. They were filled with a thick, viscous liquid that shimmered with an oily rainbow sheen. More importantly, something was struggling in the nearest lake, about 200 meters from his position. Jake grabbed his binoculars and focused on the disturbance. His breath caught in his throat. A creature roughly the size of an earth leopard was thrashing desperately in the liquid, its sleek form gradually sinking beneath the surface. But this was no ordinary animal. Its fur seemed to shift and change color like a chameleon skin, cycling through deep purples and electric blues. Most striking were its eyes, large, intelligent, and unmistakably terrified. Without hesitation, Jake threw the rover into gear and raced down the rocky slope toward the lake. His emergency training kicked in as he assessed the situation. The liquid looked too thick to be water, and the way it clung to the creature suggested it might be some kind of natural tar or petroleum-based substance. The animal was exhausting itself trying to swim through it, and Jake could see it was losing the battle. He screeched to a halt at the lake's edge and jumped out, quickly scanning his equipment. The emergency rope was rated for 500 kilograms, more than enough for a leopard-sized creature. Jake tied one end to the rover's winch and the other around his waist. He had no idea if the substance was toxic, but his environmental suit should protect him for a short exposure. The moment Jake's boots touched the liquid, he understood why the creature was struggling so desperately. The substance was like trying to walk through thick honey mixed with motor oil. Each step required enormous effort, and he could feel the liquid trying to pull him down. His suit's filtration system immediately began working overtime, and warning lights flickered on his heads-up display. The creature noticed his approach and let out a sound that was part growl, part whimper. Its eyes locked onto his, and Jake was stunned by the intelligence he saw there. This wasn't just an animal. There was something unmistakably sentient about the way it looked at him. It stopped struggling and seemed to understand that he was trying to help. Jake pushed through the thick liquid until he was within arm's reach of the creature. It was even more beautiful up close, its color-shifting fur creating mesmerizing patterns across its muscular frame. But he could see exhaustion in its movements, and parts of its body had already begun to sink below the surface. "Easy there," Jake murmured, though he doubted the creature could understand him. "I'm going to get you out of here." He reached out slowly, giving the creature time to decide whether to trust him. After a moment's hesitation, it moved closer, allowing Jake to wrap his arms around its torso. The creature was surprisingly warm, and he could feel its rapid heartbeat through his gloves. Its fur was incredibly soft despite being covered in the viscous liquid. Jake activated his suit's winch controls and felt the cable grow taut. Slowly, steadily, they began moving toward the shore. The creature remained remarkably calm, seeming to understand that struggling would only make things worse. Its eyes never left Jake's faceplate, and he found himself talking to it throughout the rescue. "Almost there," he said as they reached the shallower areas near the shore. "Just a little further. You're going to be okay." When they finally reached solid ground, Jake carefully set the creature down and immediately began cutting away the rope. The animal stood on shaky legs, thick liquid dripping from its fur. Jake expected it to bolt immediately. Most wild animals would have fled the moment they were safe. Instead, the creature sat down and began an elaborate grooming process, using its tongue and paws to clean the worst of the substance from its fur. What amazed Jake was how methodical and intelligent its approach was. It wasn't just licking randomly like a common animal might. It was systematically working to remove the liquid, starting with areas around its eyes and nose where the substance might interfere with its senses. Jake backed away to give it space and began cleaning his own equipment. His suit's decontamination systems were working to neutralize any potential toxins, but he made a mental note to run a full analysis when he got back to base camp. The liquid had an unusual molecular structure according to his suit's preliminary readings. Almost organic in nature, but unlike anything in Earth's databases. After about 20 minutes, the creature had cleaned most of the liquid from its fur, revealing the full beauty of its color-changing coat. The patterns that emerged were breathtaking, swirls of deep violet and electric blue that seemed to flow across its body like living art. Jake found himself staring, completely mesmerized by the display. The creature finished its grooming and stood up, now looking much more dignified and alert. It approached Jake cautiously, stopping just outside arm's reach. Its large eyes studied his face through the helmet's visor, and Jake had the uncanny feeling that it was trying to memorize his features. Then, something extraordinary happened. The creature began to make a sound, not growling or purring like earth cats, but something almost like speech. The sounds were rhythmic and varied, with distinct tonal patterns that suggested language rather than simple animal communication. Jake's linguistic training kicked in, and he realized he was listening to what sounded like a formal speech or ceremony. The creature's color patterns shifted as it spoke, cycling through different combinations of hues that seemed to correspond with different parts of its vocalization. Jake watched in fascination as blues deepened during certain phrases while purples brightened during others. It was as if the creature was speaking with both sound and color simultaneously. When it finished its speech, the creature performed what could only be described as a bow. It lowered its head until its nose nearly touched the ground, held the position for several seconds, then raised its head to look directly at Jake again. The message was unmistakable. It was thanking him. Jake was so stunned by this display of intelligence and gratitude that he almost forgot to respond. When his brain finally engaged, he awkwardly attempted his own bow, bending at the waist in what he hoped was a respectful manner. The creature's eyes widened slightly, and its color patterns shifted to what Jake could only interpret as pleased surprise. The moment was broken by a distant sound, a low, haunting call that echoed across the valley. The creature's head snapped toward the source, and its color patterns immediately shifted to darker, more muted tones. It looked back at Jake one final time, made another series of sounds that felt like a farewell, and then bounded away toward the source of the call with fluid grace. Jake stood alone by the lake, his mind reeling from what had just happened. He had come to this planet expecting to find minerals and geological formations. Instead, he had encountered what was clearly an intelligent species, one that had just demonstrated language, ritual behavior, and complex social awareness. The implications were staggering. As he loaded his equipment back into the rover, Jake's hands shook slightly. First contact protocols existed for scenarios like this, but they all assumed communication would happen through official channels with proper xenological support. He was just one man with basic survey equipment, completely cut off from Earth Command. The creature's final look haunted him as he drove back toward base camp. Those intelligent eyes had held something that looked almost like expectation, as if the creature knew this meeting was significant beyond a simple rescue. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he had just become part of something much larger than himself. The twin suns were setting by the time Jake reached his temporary base, casting the landscape in shades of orange and purple that reminded him of the creature's fur patterns. He powered down the rover and sat for a moment in the gathering darkness, trying to process what had happened. Tomorrow he would have to decide what to do with this information, whether to report it immediately or wait until he could re-establish proper communications. As he prepared to exit the rover, Jake noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the distance, barely visible in the fading light, shapes were moving across the landscape. Large shapes, moving with purpose and coordination. The creature hadn't been alone, and its rescue had been witnessed by others of its kind. Jake's hand moved instinctively to his sidearm as he counted at least a dozen figures approaching his position. His mind raced through possible scenarios. Were they coming to thank him? To investigate the strange alien who had helped one of their own? Or were they viewing his presence as a threat that needed to be eliminated? The shapes moved closer, and Jake could see they were similar to the creature he had rescued, but larger, some nearly the size of earth tigers. Their color patterns were more subdued in the dim light, but he could see the same intelligence in their movements that had captivated him during the rescue. Jake made a decision that would change everything. Instead of barricading himself inside the base camp or fleeing in a rover, he stepped outside and stood in the open, his hands clearly visible and empty. If these creatures were truly intelligent, they would understand the gesture. If they weren't, he was probably about to die, but at least he would face that fate with dignity. The lead creature, larger than the rest, and bearing intricate color patterns that spoke of age and authority, approached to within 10 meters and stopped. It studied Jake for a long moment, then made a series of sounds similar to those the rescued creature had made, but deeper and more complex. The other creatures spread out in a semicircle behind their leader, their positions clearly deliberate and organized. Jake took a deep breath and attempted to respond in the only way he could think of. He bowed again, deeper this time, and tried to recreate some of the sounds he had heard earlier. His attempts were clumsy and probably laughable, but the effort seemed to have an effect. The leader's color patterns shifted to brighter hues, and several of the other creatures made sounds that Jake could have sworn were laughter. The leader approached closer and began what was clearly an elaborate speech. Jake listened carefully, trying to identify patterns and recurring elements. Despite the alien nature of the language, certain emotional undertones seemed universal: respect, curiosity, and something that might have been welcome. When the leader finished speaking, it did something that nearly caused Jake's knees to buckle. From somewhere behind the group of creatures, the one he had rescued emerged, but it wasn't alone. Curled against its side, moving with the unsteady gait of the very young, was something that made Jake's breath catch in his throat. A juvenile of the species, small, fluffy, and unmistakably vulnerable. The rescued creature had been protecting its young when it became trapped in the lake. Jake hadn't saved just one life. He had potentially preserved an entire family line. The adult creature approached with its offspring and gently nudged the juvenile forward. The small one looked up at Jake with enormous eyes full of curiosity rather than fear, then made a tiny sound that was clearly an attempt to mimic its parents' earlier thanks. Jake knelt down slowly, making himself less intimidating to the small creature. The juvenile took a few hesitant steps closer, its color patterns cycling through rapid changes that suggested excitement or nervousness. When it was close enough, it reached out with one small paw and gently touched Jake's helmet. The moment of contact seemed to create a ripple effect through the entire group. Every creature present shifted their colors to brighter, more vivid patterns, and a chorus of sound arose that could only be described as celebration. Jake realized he was witnessing something unprecedented. Not just first contact, but what appeared to be formal acceptance into their community. As the celebration continued around him, Jake felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He was no longer just an explorer on a routine survey mission. He had become humanity's first ambassador to an intelligent alien species, and every decision he made from this point forward would shape the future relationship between their two peoples. The leader approached one final time and placed something at Jake's feet before stepping back. In the dim light, Jake could see it was a small, intricately carved object made for what looked like polished stone. The craftsmanship was exquisite, with flowing lines and patterns that seemed to incorporate the same color-changing properties as their fur. Jake picked up the object carefully, understanding instinctively that he was receiving a gift of great significance. It was warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with its own inner light. As he held it, the colors within the stone began to shift and flow, creating patterns that were beautiful beyond description. The creatures began to disperse, but not before each one approached Jake and performed their own version of the bowing ritual. The rescued creature and its offspring were among the last to leave, and Jake found himself fighting back unexpected emotion as he watched them disappear into the night. Alone once again, Jake stood in the darkness holding the alien artifact and trying to comprehend the magnitude of what had just occurred. He had set out to map geological formations and had instead discovered that humanity was not alone in the universe. More than that, he had potentially established the foundation for peaceful relations between species. As he finally entered his base camp, Jake carefully placed the artifact on his workbench and began documenting everything that had happened. His report would change everything, not just for the scientific community, but for all of humanity. The knowledge that intelligent, peaceful beings existed among the stars would transform human culture and philosophy in ways he couldn't even begin to imagine. But first, he had to figure out how to fix his communications array. The universe had just become a much more interesting place, and Earth needed to know. Hashtag the communication bridge. 3 days had passed since Jake's encounter with the intelligent alien species, and his world had completely transformed. What started as routine repair work on his communication array had become the most challenging engineering project of his career. Every wire he reconnected and every circuit he rebuilt carried the weight of history. This equipment would carry humanity's first official message to an alien civilization. The carved stone artifact sat prominently on his workbench, its colors slowly shifting in patterns that seemed almost hypnotic. Jake had spent hours studying it, documenting the color changes and trying to understand their significance. The patterns appeared to follow certain mathematical sequences, suggesting the object might be more than just decorative. It could be some form of communication device or cultural key. On the morning of the 4th day, Jake made a breakthrough with the communication array. The primary transmitter was functional enough to reach the orbital station, though the signal quality would be poor. He drafted and redrafted his initial report dozens of times, struggling to find words that could adequately convey the magnitude of his discovery without sounding like he had suffered a psychological breakdown from isolation. As he prepared to send his report, movement outside caught his attention. Through the base camp's viewport, he could see a small group of the alien creatures approaching. Unlike the formal delegation from 3 nights ago, this group was smaller and moved with less ceremony. Jake recognized the rescued creature immediately. Its unique color patterns were unmistakable, but the others were new individuals. Jake stepped outside to greet them, noting how the group stopped at what seemed to be a respectful distance. The rescued creature came forward alone, carrying something in its mouth. As it approached, Jake could see it was another carved object, similar to the first, but distinctly different in design. The creature placed the object at Jake's feet and stepped back, making the same series of sounds it had used before. This time, however, Jake was better prepared. He had been practicing the sounds he remembered, and while his pronunciation was undoubtedly terrible, he attempted to respond in kind. The creature's color patterns brightened noticeably, and it made sounds that Jake was beginning to recognize as encouragement or approval. One of the other creatures in the group stepped forward, smaller than the rescued one, but bearing intricate patterns that suggested maturity and status. This individual began a complex vocalization while its color patterns shifted in rapid, precise sequences. Jake realized he was witnessing something like a formal presentation or lecture. As the creature continued its communication, Jake noticed something remarkable happening with both artifacts. The stones began to glow more brightly, and their color patterns started to synchronize with the creature's fur displays. It was as if the objects were translating or amplifying the alien's communication in some way. Jake quickly grabbed his recording equipment and began documenting everything. If these artifacts were indeed translation devices or communication enhancers, they could be the key to establishing meaningful dialogue between the species. His excitement was tempered by the realization that he was operating far beyond his training and qualifications. He needed xenological and linguistic experts, not a geologist with basic first contact protocols. The presentation continued for nearly an hour, with the creature methodically going through what appeared to be different topics or concepts. Some triggered warm, bright colors in both the alien and the artifacts, while others produced more muted, serious tones. Jake began to see patterns emerging. Certain color combinations seemed to represent specific ideas or emotions. When the presentation concluded, the creature approached Jake directly and touched the artifact with one paw. The stone's glow intensified dramatically, and Jake felt a strange, tingling sensation through his gloves. For a moment, he could have sworn he almost understood something. Not words exactly, but concepts and emotions that felt alien, yet somehow familiar. The moment passed quickly, leaving Jake with the unsettling feeling that he had just experienced something far beyond current human understanding. The creatures began to withdraw, but not before the presenter left a third artifact, this one larger and more complex than the previous two. Alone again with 3 alien artifacts and a partially functional communication array, Jake faced a dilemma. His duty was to report to Earth immediately, but he also recognized that he was in the middle of establishing humanity's first diplomatic relationship with an alien species. Any misstep could have consequences that would echo throughout human history. Jake decided to compromise. He would send a basic status report to the orbital station, informing them of his extended mission timeline due to unexpected discoveries requiring further investigation. This would buy him time to learn more about the aliens and their communication methods before revealing the full scope of his findings. As he worked on his carefully worded message, Jake noticed that the 3 artifacts had begun to resonate with each other. Their color patterns were becoming synchronized, creating waves of light that pulsed through all 3 stones simultaneously. The effect was beautiful, but also slightly unnerving. Jake had the distinct impression that the objects were somehow alive, or at least operating according to principles he didn't understand. His contemplation was interrupted by a sound he hadn't heard since arriving on the planet, the distant hum of spacecraft engines. Jake rushed outside to see a sleek vessel descending from the upper atmosphere, its design unlike anything in the human fleet. The ship was organic in appearance, with flowing curves and a surface that shifted color like the alien's fur. The vessel landed gracefully in a clearing about a kilometer from Jake's base camp, and Jake watched through his binoculars as a much larger group of aliens emerged. These individuals were different from the ones he had encountered before, larger, bearing more elaborate color patterns, and moving with the unmistakable bearing of authority figures or dignitaries. Jake's communication console chimed with an incoming message from the orbital station. His earlier report had been received, and they were requesting clarification on his unexpected discoveries. The timing couldn't have been worse. He was clearly about to participate in some form of formal first contact ceremony, but he was also being pressed by his own people for information. Making a decision that would later be studied in diplomatic academies across human space, Jake sent a brief response. Discoveries require immediate extended investigation. Request communication blackout for next 72 hours to avoid contamination of findings. Will provide full report upon completion of current phase. It was a massive overreach of his authority, but Jake knew that what was about to happen was too important to be interrupted by bureaucratic protocols. He powered down the communication array and prepared to meet with what was obviously a formal alien delegation. The group from a spacecraft approached slowly and with great ceremony. Jake counted at least 20 individuals, ranging from massive creatures that could have been elders to smaller ones that might have been equivalent to diplomats or translators. At the center of the group was an individual unlike any Jake had seen before, ancient beyond measure, bearing color patterns of such complexity and beauty that they seemed to tell stories in living light. As the delegation drew near, Jake noticed that the 3 artifacts in his possession had begun to pulse with intense light. The patterns they displayed were becoming incredibly complex, cycling through sequences that reminded Jake of mathematical proofs or scientific formulations. He realized that these objects might be preparing him for formal communication with this high-level delegation. The procession stopped at the same respectful distance the other aliens had maintained, but this time the atmosphere was distinctly different. This wasn't a casual meeting or expression of gratitude. This was a formal diplomatic encounter between 2 species, and Jake was humanity's sole representative. The ancient creature at the center of the group began to communicate, and Jake immediately understood that he was witnessing something of tremendous cultural significance. The elders' color displays were so elaborate and nuanced that they seemed to incorporate every hue visible to human eyes and probably many beyond human perception. The vocalizations were equally complex, layered, harmonic sounds that created almost musical patterns. Most remarkably, the artifacts Jake carried began to respond to the elders' communication in ways that defied his understanding of physics. The stones rose from his hands, floating in the air and arranging themselves in a triangular formation around him. Their light displays became synchronized with the elders' patterns, creating a visual translation that Jake could somehow partially comprehend. Through this enhanced communication, Jake began to understand fragments of what was being conveyed. The aliens called themselves something that roughly translated to Keepers of the Flowing Light. They had been aware of human presence on their world from the moment Jake's ship had entered orbit, but had chosen to observe rather than make contact. His rescue of the individual trapped in the lake had changed everything. The act had demonstrated not just courage, but what the aliens considered the highest virtue in their culture, the willingness to risk oneself for another being without expectation of reward. This single action had elevated Jake from unknown alien to potential friend in their social structure. The elder continued its communication, and Jake began to understand the true significance of the artifacts he had been given. They weren't just translation devices or gifts. They were keys to a vast network of knowledge that the Keepers of the Flowing Light had been building for millennia. Each stone contained the accumulated wisdom and history of their civilization, accessible to those deemed worthy of trust. As the ceremony continued, Jake felt the weight of responsibility settling even more heavily on his shoulders. He wasn't just making first contact. He was being offered access to knowledge that could advance human civilization by centuries or possibly millennia. The implications for science, philosophy, and human understanding of the universe were staggering. The elder concluded its formal address and approached Jake directly. With movements that conveyed both ceremony and affection, it touched each of the floating artifacts with a limb that reminded Jake of a cat's paw, but was clearly more dexterous. The stones pulsed with brilliant light and slowly descended back into Jake's hands. Then, something happened that Jake would remember for the rest of his life. The elder placed what could only be described as a hand on Jake's helmet, and, for a moment, their minds touched. Not telepathy exactly, but a sharing of essence that transcended the barriers of species and language. Jake felt the alien's ancient wisdom, its deep love for its people, and its profound hope for the future relationship between their civilizations. In return, Jake tried to convey his own feelings, his awe at meeting them, his respect for their culture, and his determination to serve as a bridge between their peoples. The moment of contact lasted only seconds, but It established an understanding that would form the foundation for everything that followed. When the elders stepped back, its color patterns had shifted to what Jake was learning to recognize as deep satisfaction and approval. It made a series of sounds that the other delegation members echoed, creating a chorus that felt like both celebration and formal ratification of an agreement. The delegation began to withdraw, but not before each member approached Jake and performed their own version of the touching ceremony. By the time the last alien had made contact, Jake felt as if he carried the weight of an entire civilization's hopes and dreams. As the alien spacecraft departed, rising silently into the evening sky, Jake stood alone with the three artifacts and the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same. He had been transformed from an explorer into an ambassador, from a geologist into the bridge between worlds. The artifacts in his hands pulsed with warm light, and Jake realized they were somehow connected to the ship that had just departed. He could sense, though he couldn't explain how, that the aliens were offering him access to their technology and knowledge gradually, allowing him to absorb and understand at a pace that wouldn't overwhelm human cognitive abilities. Jake returned to his base camp with a mind full of wonders and a heart full of determination. Tomorrow he would have to reactivate the communication array and begin the delicate process of informing Earth about what had happened. He would need to convince skeptical authorities that he hadn't suffered a psychological breakdown, while also ensuring that humanity's response to this discovery would be worthy of the trust the aliens had placed in him. As he prepared his detailed reports, Jake carefully documented every interaction, every observation, and every nuance of alien behavior he had witnessed. He knew that his words would be analyzed by teams of experts for years to come, forming the basis for humanity's understanding of their first alien allies. The artifacts sat on his workbench, their gentle glow providing the only light in the base camp as Jake worked through the night. Their presence was comforting somehow, like having trusted friends nearby. Jake realized that in the space of a few days, these objects had become the most precious items in human possession, not just because of their alien origin, but because they represented hope for a future where humanity was no longer alone in the universe. Outside, the twin moons of Kepler, 442b, cast strange shadows across the landscape, and somewhere in the distance, Jake could hear the haunting calls of the keepers of the flowing light as they went about their nightly activities. He was no longer just a visitor to this world. He had become part of its story, and it had become part of his. The universe had become a much larger and more wonderful place, and Jake Morrison, former geologist turned humanity's first alien ambassador, was ready to help his species take its first steps into that larger universe. #The Legacy of Light. 6 months had passed since Jake Morrison's first contact with the Keepers of the Flowing Light and the small research outpost on Kepler. 442b had transformed into humanity's most important diplomatic and scientific facility. Teams of xenologists, linguists, cultural anthropologists, and engineers worked alongside their alien counterparts in a sprawling complex that seemed to grow organically from the planet's surface. Jake stood in the central communication hub, watching as human and alien researchers collaborated on projects that would have been pure fantasy just a year ago. The 3 original artifacts had been revealed to be just the beginning. They were access keys to a vast library of knowledge that the Keepers had been building for over 10,000 years of their civilization's history. Dr. Sarah Chun, the expedition's lead xenologist, approached Jake with her latest translation breakthrough. The flowing script of the Keeper language was finally yielding its secrets, and each new word opened doorways to concepts that challenged human understanding of physics, consciousness, and the nature of reality itself. "Jake, you need to see this, Dr." Chan said, her voice filled with excitement and perhaps a touch of concern. "We've made progress on translating the historical records the Keepers shared with us. What we've learned, it changes everything we thought we knew about this region of space." Jake followed her to the translation center, where holographic displays showed the elegant flowing script of the Keeper language alongside its human translation. What he read made him understand why Dr. Chen looked so troubled. The Keepers of the Flowing Light were not the first intelligent species the humans had encountered in this sector. They were the survivors. Over the past several millennia, at least 7 other civilizations had risen in nearby star systems, each achieving spaceflight and establishing interstellar communications. All had eventually fallen to various catastrophes, both natural and artificial. The Keepers had witnessed the death of entire species and had dedicated their civilization to preserving the knowledge and cultural achievements of those lost peoples. The vast library they maintained wasn't just their own history. It was a memorial to vanished civilizations and a repository of hard-won wisdom about survival in a dangerous galaxy. There's more, Dr. Chun continued, pulling up another section of the translated text. According to their records, there's a pattern to these extinctions. Something they call the silence that comes, a phenomenon that seems to target species that reach a certain level of technological development. Jake felt a chill despite the warmth of the communication center. Are they saying that all spacefaring civilizations are doomed? Not necessarily, Dr. Chen replied. The Keepers have survived for thousands of years, but they've done so by following very specific principles. They call it the path of gentle growth, technological advancement balanced with spiritual and cultural development. They believe most species fall because they develop the power to destroy themselves before they develop the wisdom to restrain that power. The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. Humanity was currently engaged in several conflicts on Earth and had colonies on dozens of worlds, many of which were mining operations that had already begun to show environmental damage. By Keeper standards, humans might be displaying exactly the kind of destructive tendencies that had doomed other species. Jake's contemplation was interrupted by an alert from the perimeter sensors. A group of Keepers was approaching the facility, but their color patterns indicated urgency rather than the usual calm deliberation of routine visits. Leading the group was Flowing Thought Like Water, the young Keeper Jake had rescued from the lake, now serving as the primary liaison between the species. Jake met the group at the facility's main entrance. Flowing Thought Like Water's usual vibrant blues and purples had shifted to darker, more agitated patterns that Jake had learned indicated serious concern. The young Keeper approached and began the complex vocalizations that, with the help of the translation system, conveyed disturbing news. Friend Jake who saves, the translation system rendered, we bring warning of great importance. Our Far Watchers have detected movement in the void between stars. Ships approach that bear the signature of the silence that comes. Jake's blood ran cold. In all their months of cultural and technological exchange, the Keepers had never mentioned active threats in space. The silence that comes had always been discussed as a historical phenomenon, not a current danger. How long do we have? Jake asked, grateful that the translation system could now render his words into the harmonic patterns of Keeper speech. Flowing Thought Like Water's colors shifted to patterns Jake recognized as calculations and estimates. By your time measurements, perhaps 40 of your days. The ships that silence move slowly, but their approach is certain. They have detected the new light songs between your people and ours. Jake immediately activated emergency protocols, sending coded messages to the orbital platforms and Earth Command. If hostile aliens were approaching, humanity needed to prepare. But even as he initiated military preparations, Jake realized that conventional human weapons and tactics might be useless against beings that had successfully destroyed multiple spacefaring civilizations. The next few days were a blur of activity as human and Keeper leaders worked together to understand the threat and develop responses. The Keepers shared their historical records of previous encounters with the silence, revealing a pattern of attacks that had persisted for millennia. The hostile entities weren't simply conquerors or raiders. They seemed to be dedicated to preventing any species from achieving true interstellar civilization. Their attacks always began the same way. The sudden cessation of all communications for the target world, followed by the gradual extinction of all advanced technology. Survivors, if any, were left with pre-industrial technology and fragmented memories of their former achievements. Dr. Chun made a breakthrough when she discovered references to successful resistance in the deepest archives. 3 times in recorded history, species had managed to survive initial attacks by the Silence, though the cost had been enormous. In each case, the key had been cooperation between multiple species and the willingness to sacrifice individual advancement for collective survival. They're not invincible, Dr. Chen explained during an emergency briefing that included both human and Keeper leadership. But defeating them requires something most species can't achieve: complete unity and the willingness to put long-term survival above short-term gains. Elder who remembers all songs, the ancient Keeper who had led Jake's formal induction ceremony, provided additional context through the translation system. The Silence feeds on division and conquest. They use our own achievements against us, turning our tools into weapons for our own destruction. Victory requires that we become something they cannot predict or understand. Jake found himself at the center of planning sessions that would determine the fate of both species. His unique position as the first human to make contact with the Keepers had given him authority far beyond his original rank, but also responsibility that kept him awake most nights. The plan that emerged was audacious in its scope and complexity. Rather than attempting to fight the Silence with conventional weapons, the combined human-Keeper forces would attempt something unprecedented: a merger of human adaptability and technological innovation with Keeper wisdom and cultural stability. The 3 artifacts that had started Jake's journey became the focal points for this unprecedented cooperation. Working together, human scientists and Keeper technicians discovered that the stones were more than cultural gifts or communication devices. They were components of a vast network that connected all Keeper knowledge and could potentially link human civilization to that same network. The process of integration was unlike anything either species had attempted. Human volunteers, carefully selected for psychological stability and cultural sensitivity, underwent a gradual bonding process with Keeper artifacts. The result was a hybrid consciousness that retained individual identity while gaining access to the accumulated wisdom of multiple civilizations. Jake was among the first to complete the process, and the experience was transformative. He could still think and feel as a human, but he also carried within him the memories of the 7 extinct civilizations the Keepers had chronicled. More importantly, he could access the strategic insights that had allowed the Keepers to survive when others had perished. The enhanced human-Keeper hybrids became the coordinators for their species' unprecedented collaboration. Human industrial capacity was redirected toward projects that incorporated Keeper principles of sustainable growth. Keeper technology was adapted to work with human engineering approaches. Most importantly, both species began developing new forms of organization and communication that transcended their individual limitations. When the ships that Silence finally arrived in the Kepler 442 system, they encountered something that had never existed before in their millennia of destruction: a truly unified multi-species civilization that had integrated its members' strengths while maintaining their individual identities. The attack began, as it always had, with attempts to disrupt communications and turn the species' own technology against them. But the hybrid network connecting humans and Keepers proved immune to such manipulation. The consciousness that guided their defense was neither purely human nor purely Keeper, but something new that the Silence could not predict or control. The battle that followed was fought as much with ideas and cultural innovations as with weapons. The Silence attempted to fragment the Alliance by exploiting historical conflicts and species differences, but the hybrid consciousness had already integrated and resolved those tensions. They tried to corrupt the Defender's technology, but the merged human-Keeper systems operated on principles that the Silence couldn't understand. Most critically, the unified civilization refused to respond to the silence with pure aggression. Instead, they attempted something that no previous species had tried. They offered the silence the same integration they had achieved between humans and keepers. The result was the first peaceful resolution of silence attack in recorded galactic history. The entities that had spent millennia destroying civilizations were revealed to be the surviving fragments of the first species to achieve interstellar flight. Ancient beings driven mad by the loss of their own people and convinced that preventing others from achieving spaceflight would somehow undo their own extinction. Through the patient application of merged human empathy and keeper wisdom, the hybrid civilization helped the silence entities remember their original purpose and identity. Rather than destroyers, they became protectors, using their vast experience to help younger species avoid the mistakes that had doomed so many before them. Jake Morrison, former geologist turned interspecies ambassador turned hybrid consciousness, stood on the observation deck of the new joint facility orbiting Kepler 442b. Below him, representatives from dozens of species that had emerged from hiding after the silence threat ended worked together on projects that would have been impossible for any single civilization. The universe was no longer a dark and dangerous place where species struggled alone against inevitable extinction. It had become a community where the strengths of each member could compensate for the weaknesses of others, where wisdom gained through suffering could be shared rather than repeated, and where the act of reaching out to help another being could literally save entire civilizations. Dr. Chen approached, her own integration with keeper consciousness visible in the slight shimmer that played around her eyes, a side effect of the enhanced perceptual abilities the process granted. Jake, we're receiving signals from the Andromeda Group. They want to know if we'd be willing to help them establish their own integration protocols. Jake smiled, feeling the warm presence of flowing thought-like water's consciousness touching his own through their shared network. The young keeper's gratitude for that first rescue had grown into something much larger, a friendship that bridged species and a partnership that was helping to transform the galaxy. Tell them yes, Jake replied, and let them know that all they need to do is be willing to reach out when someone needs help. Everything else follows from there. As he spoke, Jake felt the presence of all the hybrid consciousness members spread across known space. Humans and keepers, former silence entities, and representatives from the dozen species that had emerged from their hiding places to join the growing alliance. Each carried their own memories and perspectives, but all were united by the simple principle that had started it all, the willingness to risk oneself to help another being in need. The rescue of one small creature from a lake of viscous liquid had become the seed of a galactic civilization based on cooperation rather than conquest, wisdom rather than power, and hope rather than fear. Jake Morrison's name would be remembered not as a great warrior or brilliant scientist, but as the human who had proven that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply help someone who needs it. In the depths of space, new civilizations were taking their first steps toward the stars, guided by the knowledge that they would not have to face the darkness alone. The network of integrated consciousness grew stronger with each new member, and the galaxy became a little brighter with each act of kindness that added another link to the chain of cooperation stretching across the stars. The universe was vast and often dangerous, but it was no longer lonely. Thanks to one human's willingness to jump into a lake to save a drowning alien, the galaxy had learned that the greatest strength any species could possess was the courage to help others, even when there was no guarantee of reward or safety. And in that lesson, humanity had found not just its place among the stars, but its purpose in helping to build a universe where no one had to face extinction alone.